Welcome to the second part of our mini-series on America's two-party system. If you haven't already, definitely check out our first video on the topic, covering the Democratic Party. Just to catch you up to speed, George Washington said some words about the dangers of partisan fighting. He was very promptly ignored, and I'm assuming everyone watching this video understands we currently live in a dual-party climate, with tensions between the parties being higher today than they've been in generations. But how did we let this happen? What bricks make up the road that led to our country's schism, and can we learn anything from that history to apply towards a better future? Today we're going to look into one half of our troubling equation, the Republicans. While the first 60 plus years of American history was dominated by the Democratic Republicans, who later split into factions until the prevailing inter-party coalition rebranded themselves as the Democrats, the potential expansion of slavery into new Western territories rewrote the political climate. Opposition to slaveholding interests led to various political factions uniting to create the new Republican Party in 1854. Just a few short years later, in 1860, the promotion and opposition to slavery between Northern and Southern Democrats allowed the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, to easily win the presidency. However, his victory quickly led to 7 Southern states seceding from the Union, followed by the nation's Civil War. During the war, Republican leadership evolved from merely stopping the spread of slavery in new states to abolishing slavery outright, and upon the Union's victory, signed the 13th Amendment into law throughout the country, ensuring the freedom of near 4 million slaves. The period following the Civil War is known today as the Reconstruction, and it is here when Republican civil rights promotion for Black Americans further cemented Southern loyalty to the Democratic Party. Simultaneously, the first forays with the Republican Party association with big business began during this time, as the expansion of the country led to the increase of the role of the government. The federal government spending of money led to a feedback loop involving financiers and industrialists, who in turn owed their wealth to Republican politicians, and ended up proving more politically expedient to pursue these interests rather than to maintain solely focused on their civil rights-inspired reasons for formation, due to American cultural backlash. And by the 1900s, the Republican Party was viewed as the political party of the upper class. The progressive movement, which was beginning to change the Democratic Party in the early 20th century, had little success with the Republicans, with few exceptions like Theodore Roosevelt, who fought for labor reforms and ended up leaving the party after his presidency due to differences in direction. Near the same time, the policies of new progressive Democrats, like Woodrow Wilson, stirred tensions within the Democratic Party, as the Southern stronghold was opposed to their own party promoting an expansion of unions and federal power. Unfortunately for the Republicans, while the prosperous 1920s was associated with their party, so too was the subsequent stock market crash and the following Great Depression. The many Americans who suffered during this period grew to reject Republican resistance to intervene and provide public assistance. This backlash led to an easy presidential win for Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, whose New Deal programs proved overwhelmingly popular and ushered in decades of electoral victories for the Democrats. Consequently, Southern Democrat resentment over New Deal pro-labor reform would lead to bipartisanship efforts in Congress to prevent further expansion of unions, culminating most notably with the Taft-Hartley Bill, a bipartisanship effort of wealthy conservative Democrats and pro-business Republicans against taxation and civil rights expansion, which halted the spread of unions into the South and the American heartland by allowing states to legislate right-to-work laws. The middle of the 20th century also saw the gradual shift in party makeup, especially when it came to Black Americans. Loyalty to the Republican Party gradually began to dissipate over the course of a near century of politics, especially with the popularity of the Democratic New Deal. Despite an effort by Dwight D. Eisenhower to reclaim his party as the one who fought for civil rights, highlighted by his decision to militarily enforce desegregation of schools, it is Democratic Lyndon B. Johnson who remains most remembered for making strides during the 60s for racial justice by signing the Civil Rights Act into law. The Republicans in Congress did not largely oppose the bill's passage. However, Republican nominee Barry Goldwater did argue against it, stating that it provided too much power to the government. This proved devastating to the Republican Party electoral base, and rather than trying to make amends, Richard Nixon opted for a Southern strategy that appealed to the racism from Southern white voters. The thought process was that the Republicans could benefit more from conservative Democrats, who were already disillusioned with their own party after decades of economic progressivism. Over the course of the 60s and 70s, these conservatives fled the Democrats, while the previously Republican voting Black Americans switched parties until by the 1980s, the former Southern stronghold that once belonged to the Blue Democrats now decidedly voted red. Throughout the 1900s, a rise of evangelical Christian constituents began aligning themselves with the Republican Party, spurred by a variety of factors, including a challenge to the atheism spread by communist countries, the counterculture of the 60s provoking social anxiety, and the urging of Christian leaders to involve themselves in electoral politics. The evangelical base generally believes that a separation of church and state is to blame for a perceived decay in America's moral fabric, and they pursue their brand of promotion in society like a top-down, government pro-life stance on abortion, and re-including Christian prayer in public schools. The Republican Party noted the devotion of this voting base and started making amendments to their platform to cement their support. 1980 saw the presidency of Republican candidate Ronald Reagan, who campaigned greatly for reducing the power of the federal government, bolstering military funding, and promoting the free markets. While his economic principles would immediately be labeled Reaganomics, this was really America's foray into neoliberalism, a philosophy that Republicans and Democrats alike would go on to adopt that promoted the idea that increased unencumbered business profits would trickle down to the working class, which never really panned out. Reagan's approvals were bolstered by the collapse of America's greatest foreign adversary, the Soviet Union, but his successor, George H.W. Bush, would not be able to maintain this popularity due to fiscal policies that promised tax cuts resulting in a ballooning of the national deficit. His son, George W. Bush, however, was able to tap into American nationalism due to the 9/11 terrorist attack to serve 2 terms despite opposition to the war in Iraq and his overseeing the executive branch during the economic downturn of the Great Recession. The 2008 blue wave that led to full Democratic control of the presidency and Congress initially proved difficult for the Republicans to overcome, until they were able to turn to a populist internal movement, the Tea Party, for conservative activist support. This helped Republicans in the short term, as they were able to win back legislative chambers in the midterms during Obama's presidency, but it would begin a battle between establishment and populist Republicans who disagreed on the idea of conservatism, both on matters economic and social. This culminated in 2016 with the nomination and electoral victory of Donald Trump. During the primary process, many Republicans in office strongly opposed allowing Trump to represent the party, citing his divisive, off-the-cuff rhetoric, the support he garnered from ethno-nationalists on the alt-right, like David Duke, and callousness towards political enemies, including the mainstream media. On the one hand, Trump did manage to win one presidential term, perhaps because of these very characteristics, and growing resentment against what the establishment embodied by Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, represent. But his victory and subsequent electoral loss to Joe Biden comes at a great cost to the Republican Party, as a great number of its electoral base have attributed their loyalty to Trump and see the Republican Party as having abandoned its leader in their defeat. The modern Republican Party is a proponent of states' rights against the power of the federal government in most instances, including policing and education. They advocate for reduced taxes as a vehicle for a prosperous economy and value individual economic freedom as opposed to the more collective economic values of the Democrats. As such, they are opponents of social programs, including those intended to strengthen affirmative action and working-class specific policies. The Republican platform typically includes non-economic regulation on private life, including restrictions to abortion, while also being strongly against matters of gun control. Due to incorporation with their Christian base, the Republican Party is more open to the commingling of church and state, and as such tends to oppose the full legal recognition of those in the queer communities. The party typically supports a national policy rooted in peace through strength, and pursues US issues aggressively in the international arena. The Republican base has a wider net than even the Democrats do, with different coalitions holding sometimes contradictory priorities. At the surface, it is a primarily white and evangelical-driven party, but like the Democrats, it's important to discuss what these constituents actually want. First, there is no question that there has been a populist explosion against the perceived political establishment across the globe as a response to economic anxiety. While the Democrats have been more staunch about combating this from within their own party, as evidenced by the coalescing against Bernie Sanders during the 2020 primaries and the antagonism brewing between AOC and congressional mainstays, the Republicans have been more willing to harness this grassroots will of the people. It would be a mistake to think this populism materialized recently, however. America has long carried a nativist element that was distrustful of foreigners and prone to conspiracies to explain away economic hardships, including theories on Pearl Harbor and the World War II Yalta Conference. These isolationists, wary of increased globalization, have always found a home within the Republican Party, but they were largely kept in check by a fusionist approach that allowed the business interests of the party to remain in charge. The issue the party faces now is primarily due to this relationship being reversed. The empowerment of this white ethnic-centric populist base now implicates the very same business interests that make up the establishment, with an online-savvy faction represented by America First and their leaders, like Nick Fuentes, taking up calls to primary establishment Republicans. Next, there are still conservatives who ascribe to balancing the federal budget and economic policies that promote businesses, but their typical peace through strength mantra of military intervention has been recently under attack, as it spells a recipe for endless wars in the eyes of the isolationists. The ones who expound these beliefs without ascribing to the populist wing, while also generally not agreeing with Trump's rhetoric but approving of his policies, are known as neocons or neoconservatives, with a popular example of these being Ben Shapiro. Right-wing libertarians who don't want to vote third party also tend to coalesce behind the Republicans. These voters value property rights and defend capitalist ventures, while fiercely valuing individual liberties, which sometimes comes at odds with other Republican coalitions, such as when they advocate for the decriminalization of substances like weed for recreational use. Also worth noting is that libertarians, as America tends to define them, are a bit of an international anomaly, as libertarianism across most of the world is associated with anti-state leftism. The large evangelical presence within the Republican Party that has grown over the decades is a Christian reaction against a country that has become more secular. This faction tends to fight for their views against the normalization of America's queer communities and for anti-abortion legislation. It's important to note that, as evidenced by Donald Trump's increased inroads with diverse populations in his 2020 election bid, that his nationalist approach appeals not just to traditional conservatives, but increasingly to those who have grievances against the perceived elite of this country. Finally, possibly due to the incredibly different groups that make up the Republican voting base, there is a bit of an identity crisis on how conservatives view their contemporaries. At the time of this recording, it's been 4 months since the 2021 DC protests that led to a right-wing mob attempting to halt the confirmation of Joe Biden's presidency. On any given online platform, there is a vocal front alleging that those who stormed the Capitol building were left-wing anti-fascists, looking to frame Trump voters, while another vocal front can be found taking ownership and balking at the idea that it was anybody other than fierce patriots who were just trying to seize their country back, these supporters seemingly belonging to the America First coalition. The Republican Party of tomorrow will need to rein back in these separate groups and prevent further infighting without also alienating a moderate independent electorate who have been put off from Trump's rhetoric. It's frankly not an enviable task, but necessary if they are to keep their recent victories intact. Thank you for watching us explain America's Republican Party. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for the finale of our take on the two-party system, next time emphasizing its implications and an alternative path forward. If you have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to leave them in the comments below.